the ingenuity of an ancient anonymous Venice. But nevertheless, Venice is certainly unforgettably suggestive to a person seeing her for the first time. Venice, La Serenissima, with her burden of 1,000 years of history, cannot but leave one a little dazed. There is no other place in the world that is more make-believe, and yet, at the same time, more real. Venice, the triumph of fantasy. And we will begin our excursion accompanied by the masked characters, inviting us to penetrate the bridges and the squares of this enchanted world. Typically characteristic of this city built on the water and so unique is certainly the gondola with its iron rostrum and deliberately lopsided, one half being bigger than the other in order to counter the weight of the one-oared rower at the stern. Its origins are extremely remote, but its actual design dates back to 1562, when a decree of the Senate fixed its measurements and ordered that it be painted black as a sign of mourning. Venice is a curvilinear city, rising from the banks of the Grand Canal, the main waterway that crosses and characterizes the city. Here, it is an extraordinary how styles so different as Byzantine and neoclassic, Gothic and Manneristic, Lombardesque and Baroque manage to coexist in complete unity. Particularly impressive is Capezzo, which now houses the Gallery of Modern Art. It is a masterpiece of Longhena, Venice's greatest 17th century architect. Palazzo Vendramin, now the prestigious winter home of the gambling casino, had as its guest Richard Wagner, who died there in 1883. The car door, designed by Matteo Riverti in 1440, represents a synthesis of Venice's architectonic fantasy, bringing to exasperation its facade the classical Venetian motive or ogival loggias, embroidered with arches, columns, balustras, and fretwork, resulting in a delicate marble lace. It would be better, perhaps, to speak of a unique Venetian style, if it were not for the fact that in Venice each building is part of a figurative continuity whose unifying element is to be found in instability of the water and in the mobility of the light. The loggias of the market and the streets of the Mercery, with their characteristic colors and incessant shoutings of the vendors, create that particular atmosphere that makes one feel truly Venetian in every respect. Near the Rialto Bridge are to be found the Palazzo Grimani and the Fondaccia of the Germans, whose facade was decorated with frescoes by Giorgione e Taiti, which has since been destroyed by fire. The Rialto Bridge, which in ancient times was the only link between the two shores of the Grand Canal, is today, as it was then, the commercial centre of the city. After collapsing a number of times, the Senate decided on having it rebuilt in stone, and the most famous architects of the time, such as Michelangelo, Palladio, and Sansovino, all submitted designs. Between 1588 and 1592, it was built by Antonio da Ponte with a daring single arch spanning more than 28 meters that is still standing today to be admired. The last stretch of the Grand Canal is the most monumental. Here, pavements were not built to keep intruders away and to preserve the distinguished character of the district. The 7 palaces belonging to the Mocenigo family gave 4 doges to the Serenissima. Among their guests were Emmanuel Filiberto of Savoia and Lord Byron. Foscari, one of the most elegant palaces of the 15th century architecture, is now the seat of the economics department of the city university. In the 17th century, Ca' Rizzonico now houses a museum specializing in 18th century Venetian art. The poet Browning died there in 1889. In the 18th century Palazzo Grassi, many prestigious exhibitions are held. The Galleria dell'Accademia, as it is commonly known, was once a church, Della Carità, of which is preserved the cloister built by Palladio. It is now home of the finest collection of Venetian painting. Palazzo Papadopoli, an example of elegant Renaissance architecture, has become the seat of the city university. Further on, there's the Lombardesque Cardario, with its airy facade and characteristic chimney tops, shaped like upside-down bells. It is said that it was befallen by a curse because it kept on changing owners since 1800s to date. The Chiesa della Salute, one of the symbols of Venetian scenography, stands on the right of the Grand Canal and owes its existence to a vow. At the beginning of the 1600s, the city was inflicted by a tremendous plague, at the end of which the senators signed the construction of a temple dedicated to the Virgin in gratitude for the deliverance from the plague to the architect Longin. And finally, the Grand Canal solemnly makes its way into the basin of St. Mark, the heart and soul of the city of Venice. The Doge's palace was the political center of the Serenissima and the symbol of her prosperity and greatness. The investiture of the Doges used to take place on the grand ceremonial staircase where they were crowned with the Corno Dogale, Doge's cap, which represented the Republic and its power. It stands where the delegates from Constantinople established their residence in the 9th century. Today, it is still as suggestive as it was in the past. The centuries fall away, and its atmosphere arouses the same awe that used to overcome the ambassadors and the representatives of foreign countries when they entered the magnificent palace. Piazza San Marco, or better, the Piazza, is the only one in the city where one can still feel the atmosphere of wealth, elegance, and worldliness characteristic of the Belle Epoque. The Basilica of San Marco is Venice's greatest historical and architectonic monument. The original basilica was demolished in the 9th century, and in its place the present basilica began to be constructed in 1073. For 5 centuries, it continued to be enriched with mosaics, decorations, and sculptures. Suffice to say that inside and out, more than 500 columns can be counted in all shapes, sizes, and materials. Standing imposingly beside the basilica is the bell tower, which has been the same for centuries and is one of Venice's most characteristic symbols. Worth remembering is, in 1902, it collapsed within itself without injuring anyone, proving to be as dignified as only Venice is capable of being. Almost hidden from sight is the Bridge of Sighs, which links the Doge's palace to the ducal prison, and was given this name because when being led to his cell, the prisoner would catch his last glimpse of freedom from this very bridge. But there exists also another Venice. Perhaps the best way to penetrate the heart of this city is to roam casually along, following a route which only logic rests in the capricious progression of its lanes and canals. Venice rises on an archipelago made up of 100 islets, separated from one another by about 150 canals, which, where there were still very few paved streets, were the easiest communication routes. Just about the entire city, however, can be covered on foot, thanks to its numberless bridges. There are about 400, each with a history of its own. There is, for example, the Ponte di Pugni, Bridge of Fists, near Santa Barbara, where fellows from two rivaling factions, Castello and Dorso Duro, used to meet for public fistfights, a very popular game played on many other bridges called Ponte di Guerra, bridges of war. The city, whose perimeter measures 13 kilometers, is divided into 6 districts called sestieri, representing the only reference point for locating houses, which are endowed with a very curious numbering system. In Venice, there are several different grades of streets, each with specific characteristics, as calli, rive, and so on. Houses were characterized by outdoor staircases, of which some examples remain, such as the Scala del Bovolo at the Palazzo Contarini, bovolo being the Venetian term for snail. In Venice, there are no squares apart from the Piazza and the Piazzetta of San Marco, and the Piazzetta dei Leoncini, to the north of the Basilica. The open spaces around which each section of the city is clustered are called campi, fields, and campielli because, before being paved, they were covered with grass and served as animal pastures. A focal point of the Serenissima were the docks of the arsenal, which put out to sea the Republic's powerful warships. According to tradition, the arsenal was founded in 1104, but expanded only in the second half of the 5th century. On the average, the arsenal counted more than 2,000 workers. But in the period immediately preceding the War of Lepanto, 3,000 workers were taken on, and in 50 days they managed to build 150 galleys. Record time, even for present-day standards. The churches of Venice stand in witness to the architectonic and urbanistic development of the city. The Church of Santa Maria del Miracoli, for example, is Pietro Lombardo's masterpiece and is one of the most characteristic monuments of the 15th century Venetian architecture. The Church of San Giovanni, together with its cloister, is another example of Gothic Renaissance style. And the Church of the Madonna del Orto, not included in the more popular itineraries, is of particular Gothic beauty. The Carmini Church, built towards the middle of the 14th century, gives on to Campo Santa Margherita, rising majestically from the narrow calle of the Sestiere. The scuola in Venice were important institutions set up to perform temporal works of mercy, combining political, social, and religious aims. This ideology was also taken up even by a group of prostitutes who decided on working together and directing their ancient profession. The group was commonly known as Scuoletta di Donne. The scuola of San Giovanni Evangelista and the scuola of San Rocco, near the church of Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari, were the two richest and most powerful associations of the Gothic Renaissance period. Towards the end of the 1400s, the synthesis in act between art and Venetian culture and the contribution of scholars coming from outside, especially from Lombardy and Tuscany, favored the germination of a particular interpretation of Gothic that tended to merge with acceptance of the new concept of Renaissance. This fusion can be noted in the Church of San Zaccaria, built in 1480. The Dominican Church of Santi Giovanni of Paolo, in front of which stands the colossal Verrocchio statue of the famous Venetian condottiere Bartolomeo Colleoni, is considered the pantheon of Venice, as 25 doges are buried within. Another characteristic feature is the protective parapet of the cisterns called Vera da Pozzo, owing to their ring shape. Venice counts more than 200 and some are of extraordinary beauty. The purity of line and form of the Scuola Grande of San Marco makes one forget that it is now the seat of the Civil Hospital. The 16th century marked the beginning of the commercial and political decline of the Serenissima, but at the same time, a new fervid season was setting in that would make Venice one of the most cultural centers in Europe. But the new image the Venetian aristocrats wished to assume was best expressed by Palladio, who reproposed classicism in colossal form. Venice, Baroque was kept out of the problems arising from Roman and European absolutism, but constituted instead the ideal bridge between the tradition of Venetian classicism and neoclassicism. In this light must be seen the Church degli Scalzi and the Church of San Moisè. Palazzo Pisani today is the seat of the Conservatory. It's classical in style and represents the passing from Palladiano classicism to true neoclassicism. Once again, the mask introduces us to another side of Venice's complex character. Rain and fog do not diminish her charms, but heighten those emotional and intimate feelings of men like Thomas Mann, Visconti, Hemingway, and Wagner. Water is the constant element that separates Venice from her islands. On Murano, the island of blown glass, there are many establishments of glassblowers who are isolated against the impending danger of fire by an edict of the Serenissima, but share the privileges of the aristocracy. Each vase and each statue conceals the secret of an ancient tradition that today the glass blowers still adopt with the same passion and love of the past and with the same prestige. The ferry boat then takes us to Burano. That reminds one of a bombiniere full of colours and perfumes. The houses seem as if they have been built for dolls, and the lace made on this island is appreciated and admired throughout the world. It is not rare to find women along the streets sitting beside their houses, producing these small, beautiful masterpieces. comes Torcello, almost like an oasis in the Venetian lagoon. With nature uncontaminated and Byzantine architecture, in memory of the period in which the Serenissima used to adorn herself with whatever she could get hold of that was rare and precious in a commercial and political expansion towards the east. Each one of these islets is very different from the rest, but together they form a retinue of maids around their queen. On returning from the islands, landing is made in the basin of St. Marco, which is another focal point of the city, and here most of the maritime and commercial activity takes place. To sanction our eternal dominion, we, Doges of Venice, wed you, O sea. The Venetians cannot forget their age-old history of victories at sea, and they do not fall short of reviving their memory through demonstrations such as the Grand Historical Regatta, on which occasion the bigger, gaudier boats reserved for parades are pulled out. Bucintoro, Bisone, Bolotine, and a whole extraordinary variety of boats from the lagoon. The Volga Longa, on the other hand, represents the grand kermis of the sea. The lagoon, on the other, offers the opportunity to meet and compete in that fluid, changing element that makes Venice a unique and unrepeatable city. Venice is just like the Harlequin portrays her, an immense theatre in which the city herself is represented. It is not a mere coincidence, in fact, that Goldoni was born here, and that Carnival, which in the 700s used to last 6 months, has come back to life. This non-stop show is one of Venice's most popular and universally renowned attractions, which, however, also has more intimate and mysterious side. Here, in fact, resides fantasy, which kept us company throughout our journey and finally decides to come out of its hiding place, exploding in the joy and in the colors of the people crowding the city, especially Piazza San Marco. The fusion of art and history with fantasy is celebrated today just as it was 1,000 years ago, thus proving Venice to be that immortal, timeless and ancient city, that tradition established.